Hello, and welcome to the first installment of the new e-panel series, Leading in Crisis. Today's topic is one that you might feel very familiar with. Feeling like you didn't sign up for this, and other pastor realities of 2020. GBHEM is delighted to present this discussion in collaboration with the Council of Bishops Leadership Development Team. I'm Reverend Shannon Conklin-Miller. I am the Associate General Secretary in the Division of Ordained Ministry at GBHEM. I'll be the moderator for this panel, and I am joined by two renowned leaders from our United Methodist Council of Bishops. Speaking from his home in California, we have Bishop Grant Hagiya of the California Pacific Annual Conference. Bishop Hagiya earned his MA, his MDiv, and his DMin from Claremont School of Theology, and he also holds a doctorate in education from Pepperdine University. He's previously served as the executive director of the Center for Leadership Excellence, and he's the author of Leadership Kaizen, How to Become a Better Church Leader. Welcome, Bishop Hagiya.
Good to be with you, Shannon, and Bishop Carter.
Thank you, Bishop Hagiya. And joining us from the Sunshine State, we have Bishop Ken Carter of the Florida Annual Conference. Bishop Carter is the outgoing president of the Council of Bishops and holds master's degree from Duke Divinity School and the University of Virginia, as well as a doctor of ministry from Princeton Theological Seminary. He's the author of multiple books on practical ministry, including his most recent, Pray for Me, the Power of Praying for Others. Welcome, Bishop Carter.
Thank you. Thank you, Shannon. Thank you, Bishop Hagiya. And thank you all.
We are pleased to have both of you with us today. And we'd like to also thank all of you who are joining us via YouTube and Facebook Live. After our initial discussion, we'll leave time at the end to take some audience questions. So if you have a leadership question for the bishops, please submit it in the comments on either Facebook or YouTube, and we'll do our best to answer as many of your questions as time allows. We will begin our discussion in a moment, but before we do need and desire to acknowledge today that today is a day of remembrance. On this date in 2015, a white supremacist murdered 9 members of Charleston's Emmanuel African Methodist Episcopal Church. As people of faith, we are called not only to remember their lives, but to stand up and to speak out against the racist hatred that motivated their murders. So I'd ask that you would bow your heads or otherwise be in a spirit of prayer and remembrance as Bishop Hagiya leads us in a moment of prayer.
Loving and gracious God, we come before you today dealing with the twin pandemics of COVID-19 and the worldwide struggle for justice, equality, and the eradication of all forms of racism. We especially remember those killed at Mother Emanuel AME 5 years ago. For their families and loved ones who still grieve, let us not forget them and enable this to fuel our stand against racism. Help us to follow John Wesley's own rules, do no harm or safety for those who we serve from the coronavirus, balanced by doing good in the form of protest and active change. Enable us to attend to the ordinances as a way to discern when to strive for safety and when to risk active engagement. Make us wise leaders and followers in light of what you ask of us today and the days to come. Through Jesus Christ we pray. Amen.
Amen. Thank you, Bishop. Thank you, Bishop Hagiya. We chose to begin this Leading in Crisis discussion series because, as you just prayed and mentioned, Bishop Hagiya, we are all living in such a uniquely uncertain time. The United States and the world are confronting the two pandemics simultaneously, COVID-19 and the violence of systemic racism. And many clergy and lay leaders are wondering how they move forward from here and how they can lead when the definition of normal, when the standards of engagement seem to be changing on an almost daily basis. So bishops, I wonder, how how can clergy and lay leaders set new standards, new visions for their churches right now? What do their followers need from them at this time?
Well, thanks, Shannon. I think I'll start with this. I think the first thing is that in times of crisis, you need leadership to stand forth. I'm reminded of Peter Drucker's famous line. He used to say this quite often. You know, when the seas are calm, anyone can pilot the ship. But when that storm hits, then you need the captain at the helm. And it's not Drucker's image of the heroic leader either, the solo charismatic leader. Now it's collaborative leadership. No single leader can lead with effectiveness because of our blinders. And now it is a matter of a collaborative team that steps forth and leads. So I would remind you of Gallup's research, in which they found that the four basic needs of followers, and this is not in a crisis, by the way, this is just in general. And I would say in a crisis, these are heightened. It's just exaggerated what is necessary here. And the first one is trust. And what does that mean? It's authenticity. It is the sense of transparency and integrity. There is a competency element of trust, but that takes second nature to the sense of people believing in you. And that leads directly to the second one, compassion. People have to believe that you have their best interest at heart. And so that there's a sense in which one feels there's a relationship built around care for me. And then you would go to stability, the need for grounding, I think. And we spiritual leaders have the greatest grounding available, and that is God in Jesus Christ. And then the last one, of course, is hope, a sense of a promised future, a sense of that we will get through this and we'll be okay. So just want to remind you leaders that these four are critical during a time of crisis. And I think that this will lead right into Bishop Carter's understanding of non-anxious presence.
Right. Right. Thank you, Grant. And just trying to say something that would complement that wisdom. We're in a season of stress and anxiety and crisis. In my own mind, the image I've had is like we're playing chess on three levels. We had the denominational stress of the movement toward inclusion and our work toward restructure toward a general conference that was delayed by the COVID-19, by the pandemic. And we have had the surfacing of the recognition of the reality of racism in the murders of several in the last month. And so how does a person lead in that kind of environment? I'm very much influenced by the work of Ed Friedman. Ed Friedman was a rabbi, a systems theorist, a therapist, and I was able several years after graduating from seminary to spend a year with him in a postgraduate seminar. And he had a concept that was called self-differentiation. And self-differentiation is not building a consensus. It's not relying on our charisma. It is the capacity of the leader to discern his or her position, to state that position clearly, and to stay in touch with others in the system and not to withdraw from them. And so in this season, this is not about being dependent on praise, the praise of others, or even their support, or becoming obsessed with criticism. It is to try to be detached from all of that and to simply discern and state our values. And if we can do that, it makes the whole field less anxious, and it opens us up to access more creativity, more resources, and more hope for the future. And so that's where a leader can begin during this time.
Both of you have mentioned stress and anxiety that have emerged that leaders are feeling during this time. There are stressful times for all of us. Congregations may have lost members due to the virus, or members may be newly out of work. And dealing with this is made so difficult because many of our normal rituals of mourning, of celebration, of gathering together and support are simply not possible because of the pandemic. So I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit more about how clergy and lay leaders can maintain this non-anxious presence in the midst of this anxious world, particularly anxious during this time.
Thank you. That's a great question. That's the question where we're all living. Right. And I would say that first is to recognize, if we could show the slide around anxiety and stress, that we all have a range of responses to life based on our levels of anxiety. And when we're working with other leaders, with persons in our communities and congregations, is to extend some grace to them, that people are living with a great deal of anxiety. And the COVID experience has surfaced inequities in our health system, inequities in who does essential work. All of this flows into the congregations that we lead. And so we have a range of responses to that. Ed Friedman encouraged us not to try to diagnose or even change other people, that's not where leadership begins, but instead we work on our own self-differentiation, our own spiritual life. One time I was with Ed Friedman, and I had come across just a brief sentence that Thomas Merton wrote. And Thomas Merton said, "I never did try to change other people. I simply tried to work on my own spiritual life." And Ed Friedman looked at me and he said, "Bingo." And we're still reading Thomas Merton's books 50 years later. And so our role is to preserve the integrity of the body, the integrity of the community, the congregation. And so in the COVID experience, it is to say we love our neighbor by maintaining a social distance from them. In a time of intense and very public racial murders, the murders of Breonna and Ahmaud and George and Rayshard, it is to say Black Lives Matters. And this is what the gospel is. And in doing this, we're preserving the integrity of the system. Ed Friedman had this concept that stress is not so much a matter of the amount of work we do as being triangulated. And it's just recognizing the triangles. For example, in Florida, the church is given very different guidance to our local churches and how we gather than the state government's guidance has been. And so we understand that people feel triangulated, and yet we have leaned into that stress in order to preserve the integrity, that the health of the body is most important, and especially our most vulnerable members. We also think about the future and move into that direction. I know Bishop Hagiya is going to talk about that. And then lastly, that in a time of anxiety and stress, it's not about keeping the peace, but challenging people, expecting more of people, saying to them, we can do this. We can worship online for several months. And at times reach many more people. I can confront my own racism and you can also, and we can stay with this discomfort. And Friedman had a bit of wisdom that the higher our threshold for pain, the more likely we are to grow. Our world has witnessed approaching 500,000 persons who've died from this virus, 118,000 in the United States, 30 million persons have lost jobs. These murders in the Black community have triggered 400 years of trauma, and so I'm speaking to especially to white Anglo leaders here. The higher our threshold for pain, not avoiding this, but moving into this, the more likely we are to grow as disciples.
Yeah, and to follow that, I'm taking a mindfulness course now, which is challenging me greatly. But we're learning a lot more about brain physiology than we've ever learned before, simply because our tools are much more strengthened in this area. And there is an almond-shaped brain part of the brain near the brain stem. That's the blue part. And it's called the amygdala. And the amygdala really has a couple of functions. It's a very old part of our brain, but it controls our ability to be aware of danger. So it was a great evolutionary tool for us, because this could distinguish whether that beige rock is a rock or a lion that's stalking us. And immediately the amygdala comes into play in our lives. And it triggers three distinct reactions. One is to freeze, one is to flee, and one is to fight. So those three are instantaneous. We really don't have much control over that. And it's very striking, because I was speaking to one of our African-American leaders, lay leaders, in a context of planning for our annual conference. And she said, I'm absolutely frozen. I can't even hardly move anymore because of all of this. And that is that amygdala going off. And as Bishop Carter has says, what we try to do with this stress is to try to move it to our rational brain, which is the front part. And this is what we call the prefrontal cortex. This is thinking and creativity. Now, the right prefrontal cortex reacts directly from the amygdala, and that is it processes anxiety and worry and plans out how we can move forward. But it's also prone to depression and anxiousness and anxiety. Whereas the left prefrontal cortex is the creative part of our brain that enables us to have feelings of happiness, contentment, grounding. And what we need to do, as Bishop Carter says, is buy the time in order to have the creativity of our brain take over and give us this sense of moving forward in some practical way. So I hope that's helpful in an understanding of our basic physiology and who we are.
Thank you. I think it's been helpful to hear from both of you how, as individual leaders, clergy and laity can think about how they process their stress and anxiety, how they can lead, and what's needed for them. I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit more about not only what strategies can be used personally in terms of individuals, but also using your experiences with your own conferences. Can you offer some practical guidance on how clergy and lay leaders can influence the system? Can lead within their context to support communities of color and to use faith to address the sins of racial violence and discrimination?
Hmm. Yeah. I'll begin with some humility and confession. I think we can listen and we can move toward the conflict, move toward our failure, rather than avoiding that or being silent. A number of siblings in the Black church have said to me, "We want you to speak. We don't expect that what you're going to say is going to be perfect, but we want you to speak. We don't want you to be silent." And we don't want to have to carry the weight of this all the time. And so it is living in the both and world of having some humility and listening, amplifying voices that sometimes are marginalized. At the same time, where we have privilege, where we have power, it is speaking and walking alongside, and I think saying this is one step in a journey, and I've also learned that it's important to make statements. Our cabinet made a statement. Our SEJ bishops made a statement. The Florida Council of Churches made a statement. I was a part of all of those statements. A statement is necessary, but it is not sufficient. And a statement is a way of holding ourselves accountable and saying to our church, to the body, we're not silent here. That's a beginning. Yeah.
Yeah, and I'll just pick up on that. As a person of color, been deeply affected by all of this. In that much of the COVID-19 has been directed towards Asians, and we've had many outbreaks of people saying, "Go back to where you came from." Well, I'm from here, so hard to go back from here. But the reality is that this movement has produced a sea change in terms of culture, our culture. One, it's no longer okay to be non-racist. Now we have to be anti-racist. And I think that's a positive direction. Now it's not the fact that you don't have to say anything. Corporations, businesses, whatever, they have to take a stand. So that has changed dramatically from the past. My children run a gym, and because they have both police and regular folks in the gym, they did not make a statement. They've been deeply criticized for not taking a stand as the gym. Now, in the past, you would say a business like that didn't have to make a statement, but this small gym in this community is being pushed to say, where do you stand on these issues of Black Lives Matter? Where do you stand about racism? And they've had to make a public statement. And this is all good, I think, in the sense that there is this movement to do something now against the standards of racism. And so I think for myself, it's enabling our annual conference to deal with it directly, not to sweep it under the rug like it's always been, but to deal with our own racist feelings, with our own attitudes of prejudice and bias. That's where it begins. And then have community discussions on how we can be proactive in taking a stand against it and being the force that will eliminate it in the future, especially our own institutional racism, because it's the church's unfinished business. We have never taken this on like we should have, even though we've danced around it in the past. So I'm praying and hoping that this will be different and that the church will directly confront its own racism.
I think we all are praying and hoping for that same thing, and not only praying and hoping, but taking practical steps, I hope as well, to do that. Yeah. I know that we have seen a lot of change over the last 3 months, and we're doubtless going to see more before this year is over. So I am wondering if what is your advice to clergy for leading in scenarios they've never been trained for, both confronting the challenges of the pandemic of COVID-19 and of racial injustice, having to confront this in new ways?
Well, let me begin with the adaptive leadership folks that I've tried to stay close to. And they wrote a wonderful article in Harvard Business Review on the crisis, adaptive leadership in crisis. And so there's a slide that we could put up on that, and we'll show you. Here it is. Heifetz, Linsky, and Grashow, authors of this particular article, have three phases distinctly. One is the emergency phase, when we're in the middle of the crisis hits. No one could have predicted COVID-19 or the amount of violence that has happened to our Black community in the last few months. But in this emergency phase, we stabilize and we buy time. And this is really, we're all caught off guard. And remember the freeze, flight, or fight reaction. We have a tendency to do that. And this allows us the time to let the rational thinking set in, which a non-anxious presence always helps with. So immediately, Bishop Carter and I closed our churches. We needed to buy time. It wasn't safe. And that seemed the prudent thing to do. It stabilized things because it enabled our churches to become more innovative, to go online, to live stream, to do things that could compensate from the church being shuttered. But then you move to the initial adaptive phase. And this is where you tackle the underlying causes and build capacity. You start thinking about what is needed next, about how long this is going to last. And many of you have been familiar with Andy Crouch's article on whether this is going to be a blizzard, a season, or a mini ice age. And really, it's turning out to be all three, but mostly the mini ice age. An epic is happening here. And in this sense, the underlying causes of especially racial injustice are need to be laid bare, and for us to discuss those. And it's a wonderful time for the church to build capacity by going outside its walls and collaborating with the community, talking with Black Lives Matter leaders, talking with movements of racial justice. This is our time to build the coalitions that are going to set the wave that is coming, and being a part of that rather than missing out or burying our heads in the sand. This is a wonderful phase for the church. And then the final phase is the long-term adaptation phase. And this is to foster adaptation, next practices, innovation, experimentation. This is the time that we don't pull back and say we're going to reopen our worship, but we stay with this paradigm of creativity and innovation and try to find new ways to make the church relevant to the not only itself, but to the surrounding community. So this is that non-anxious phase where we're letting our creativity and our sense of grounding dictate where the future is going to go. So we hope that this is helpful in a kind of phased understanding of dealing with these twin pandemics.
Hearing a little noise. I don't know where it is. I just want to take a moment just to express my gratitude to Grant. I first met Grant when I was a pastor. He was a superintendent, and we were on a denominational board. And then he chaired a committee when he was a bishop and I was a pastor for a ministry study. And then we've been in the Council of Bishops. You often hear in social media how about how the divisions in the church. We're in two different jurisdictions. I have profound respect for Bishop Hagiya, and we were on the commission on the way forward together, and I just always learn from him. So I wanted to say that, and I think in this time, we are blessed by what we can learn from each other, and we need to lean into that. I want to affirm his mentioning the article by Andy Crouch and colleagues about this period that I think we're in a kind of a 12 to 18 month period, if we can see it in that way. That roughly corresponds, I think, to the creation of a vaccine, and that roughly corresponds to our moving toward a new structure as a United Methodist Church and the rescheduled General Conference and our polity. And so how do we live in that season? And I get that there are probably some folks listening to this thinking, you both are bishops, your life is different than mine. But I want to just say that I was a pastor for 28 years, and I do understand the life of a clergy leader. So I would say it's really important that we try to regulate our own anxieties, and we do that through spiritual practices. In the month of April, I read through the book of Psalms, 5 Psalms a day, every day for those 30 days. And now I'm in a group of people who are reading chapter in the Gospels every day in the summer, centering prayer, taking walks, paying attention to our health. That's really important. The health of the leader is really important. And our conference is going to do pretty serious anti-racism training this year. We're going to try to intentionally re-enter our buildings, and we're also focusing on clergy health. I think it's really important for us, and I'll summarize 2 or 3 of these together, to state who we are and what our dream is for the church. We are learning in this season that our path to holiness as Wesleyans has got to be to love our neighbor and to put aside our preferences. And I have a strong preference to want to be inside my church building, to be with these people that I love. And yet we are people who are on a journey to holiness, and we cannot be on a journey to holiness unless we love our neighbor. And we cannot say we love God, whom we've never seen, if we don't love our neighbor, whom we have seen. And in this moment, what it means to love our neighbor is also to love our sisters and brothers or persons of color who are being harmed, either through the racism toward the Asian community and COVID, and that's very close to our family as well. One of our family members, a relationship, and the other is the African American community. But this affects the Native American community, and we could go on. I think it's important if you're leading. This is also probably where you live and lead every week, to try not to be reactive to the least mature persons in your community. Try not to obsess about that email or that comment. Just to, as they say in centering prayer, just let it float away down the stream. Expect that if you're leading people in a direction, you're going to get sabotage. And Ed Friedman had a wonderful fable called The Bridge, which was about sabotage. Understand there's a lot at stake here, that we embody this stress of this season. This has to affect us, what's happening, and we have to pay attention to this. But understand that this stress may show up in your spouse or in your children. We're parts of family systems. And then I would say just use some of this time to think. Grant mentioned Peter Drucker, who was a very thoughtful leader to think about the future. Drucker said the future has already begun. The future has already started. And so God is teaching us something through this trauma. And the question is, what do we learn from it? And what is God's dream for the church? And so, I would say that, none of us ever signed on for something like this, but it may be surfacing. I'm not trying to put a positive spin on any of this. There's great pain here, and trauma. But I have also heard some pastors say, this is putting me in touch with what I really feel called to do.
Thank you, Bishop Carter and Bishop Hagiya. I think that word about call actually segues nicely into a question that we received from one of our audience, and that is what advice you would give to candidates for ministry, people who are perhaps not currently in leadership in the church or are not clergy or lay leaders, but are hoping to feel called to the ministry, and are feeling anxious and stressed about being leaders in the denominational context and in this new ministry context.
Actually, Bishop Carter does this too, I'm sure, meets with the candidates before ordination, both commissioning and ordination. And we usually ask them the question, why would you want to be ordained now in this time, especially in the church's life? The articulation of the answers have been so inspirational. Young, brilliant candidates tell us, why not? This is the time. This is the time that the church needs innovation and newness. And this is the time that perhaps I could step forward, a call on their lives, really, to become that presence that's going to make difference in the world and the church. So I would say, why not? As they tell me, this is the moment. And maybe we're being called for just a time as this in our lives.
Yeah. And I would add to that, persons in our roles like, Shannon, Grant, me, persons in our roles are to create opportunities for people to fulfill their callings, to try to find the resources for those persons to do that. When I became a bishop, I really realized it was no longer about me. It was about seeing people and creating opportunities for them. It is a given that we live in a very fluid, rapidly changing world. And so we've been talking about adaptive leadership and really reactivity and how to regulate our anxieties through that so we can lead. The future is very open. The positive side of that is that there is the necessity of innovation and creativity. The challenge is for us to try to build in support systems and to really use our resources well so that we have the capacity for people to live out their callings. I call it, in my context, we're trying to keep people whole so that they can fulfill their callings. And I believe that God will provide. Gil Rendell has a great insight in his book on quiet courage that he says we should not use the language of scarcity and abundance, but we should use the language of sufficiency. And I think God's grace is sufficient and God will provide.
Thank you. We have a question from Jamie on YouTube, who asks, what is a word of encouragement to rural pastors like me who are passionate for racial justice and also serving churches that are largely uninterested in that work?
Sure. I'll start. I've been reading an extraordinary book called Dying of Whiteness. It was recommended by Dr. Kendi, who's written the book on anti-racism. The author is a physician and sociologist at Vanderbilt, and he really talks about how many white persons who don't live in elite context vote against their own interest in terms of education, health, and even how gun violence becomes more prevalent, and these policies actually shorten the lifespans of persons and of white persons in rural communities. This is much more complex than I'm opening up about. But I would recommend just conversations about the disparities of resources, and the urban-rural divide is significant, and I think this. I mean, the questioner lives in that context, and so it is simply to try to understand where the persons are coming from, and I'll just say I don't have a great answer to a conversation about race in that person's context.
Yeah, and I could just follow in terms of relational selves. In our rural settings, it's all about relationship. It really is anywhere, but especially there. So as Bishop Carter says, to listen and be in relationship and to provoke a conversation that is not going to be stressful, but at least raise the issues, as he had mentioned, I think is really critical right now. And the fact that we are in relationship with our people, wherever they are on the spectrum of these issues, is helpful, because then we have an avenue for change. We have an avenue for them to look at who they are. And I think in that relational understanding and context, we accept them unconditionally, just as God does. But that doesn't mean we accept their position and their sinfulness. And we have to push a little bit, always in a loving and supportive way. So it's a tough situation, but I think avoidance is really the worst thing. Try to be relational in that kind of direction.
I think that that we have a question from Kristen on Facebook that your comment relates to. She asks, do we have, that you mentioned trust and do we have their best interest? Do they trust that we have their best interest in mind? And at the same time, don't try to keep the peace, challenge the peace. So can you say more how to do both, how to hold those two in tension and to move forward?
To me, it's the call to be a priest and a prophet. And a wise mentor said to me one time that we build up capital in our ministries through relationships, but then this person said at some point you need to use that capital. It's not about being liked. It is about being on a journey and recognizing that we ourselves are on journeys, and that persons had patience with us and yet led us on a journey. And so I think, Grant's comment about relationships, we've both done a lot of work with the Anatomy of Peace, which is about our way of being, our not stereotyping other people, understanding their stories, listening to their stories, seeing where the commonality is of stories. In that book, it's about the Israeli-Palestinian relationship. But I think it's the holding intention, the being a priest, and the being a prophet, and so I would begin there.
And let me just follow my first church, 26 years old, right out of seminary, and I was like their grandson for this congregation. Mostly Japanese American, second generation, which are very conservative. And I remember it was during the end of the Vietnam War. And of course, I have these very progressive opinions. And I was going to march against UC Berkeley because of their investments. And I remember preaching a sermon, "Will you march with me?" Now, that was like heresy for these folks. They would never go to a march. And I thought I was going to get a lot of fallout from that. But what had happened is I had built relationships with them so that they really did feel, as Bishop Carter says, a sense of trust with me in relation. And they basically said, well, you know, he's a little bit crazy in terms of this social agenda, but we still love him. I heard that numerous times from them. And it wasn't the fact that I got them to march. Actually, 2 people came up, which was really phenomenal to me. But the fact that they accepted the fact that I could do that and that they would not ostracize me, they would not condemn me for something that they disagreed with. So I think it's critical in the sense of influence, and John Maxwell calls it change in your pocket. You got to use that, as Ken says, eventually.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. We have one last question that I think we have time for, and that is a question from Joy on Facebook. She asks, what impact do you think the pandemic will have on General Conference and moving forward with a more inclusive church?
Yeah. Why don't I start on this one, and Ken can follow me? I think it's going to be profound. I think that this has put us in our place in some ways, that this issue of sexual equality, LGBTQI inclusion has dominated our psyches. And then new issues arise that diminish it in some ways as a denominational problem. Now, the problem is still there. We have to deal with this. But perhaps we will deal with this in a way that's more compassionate and more caring. And if anything, COVID-19 has provided us the chance to come back to ourselves and do self-reflection and introspection. And maybe with the push for racial justice and against police brutality, we can understand that it's all about other people, not about us. And I'm hoping that that will temper the anxiety and temper the anger and enable us to deal with this in a constructive and positive way going in to our postponed General Conference.
That's a great question. And just a few maybe scattered thoughts about it, nothing systematic. First, like many people, I had some real disappointment when the General Conference was postponed. I had been very involved in the Commission on the Way Forward, very involved in the protocol of separation through grace and reconciliation, and felt like we were on a journey to find some resolution and to have a United Methodist Church without this language. And so the postponement, which required a 16-month time frame, at first, that was my sense. then the magnitude of the COVID taught me that we had been in these silos, and it taught me how interconnected we are. And as we reached out to people, as people worked together, some of those silos began to break down. And then I would say with the murders that have been in the Black community and that have galvanized us all, it has reminded us that there is a larger framework for human dignity and for human rights and for justice. And so all of that will flow into this conference. The fact that it's in Minneapolis will also frame this, and I'm not disparaging Minneapolis. This injustice happens everywhere, and there are some heroic, faithful people in that community. But it has to shape the future of the church. And I don't think we know what God will do with all that, but God will hopefully use that and use us to create the next church. And I think right now we are involved in this pandemic. Florida had its highest number of cases yesterday. So right now we're in this pandemic. Right now we are watching to see how justice happens. We are beginning laying the plans for anti-racism training, I know all across the church in an urgent, important way. But I believe that as the winter and spring get here and the summer, we will turn back toward that. The structure of the church is not the most important thing, but structure provides a way in which we do the work of God, and it's important, and so that's still work to be done, and I am sure it will all be sort of knit together as we move into it.
Thank you. I'm sorry that we don't have the time to address all the questions that you and the audience have brought forward. But we encourage you to keep the conversation going in your congregations and in your conferences. And I want to thank the bishops, Bishop Hagiya and Bishop Carter, very much for speaking with us and for sharing your words of encouragement and hope and also confession. It's very helpful. And I want to thank our audience for tuning in and sharing your questions as well. If you've missed any of today's discussion, the full recording will be posted on GBHEM's Facebook page and the YouTube channel. And I also want to invite you to join us for our next two Leading in Crisis e-panel discussions. And perhaps the questions that we weren't able to get to are ones that we could address in the future. These e-panel discussions will take place on July 15th and August 12th. Our July panel will feature Bishop Latrell Easterling of the Baltimore-Washington Conference and author Susan Beaumont. And our August panel will feature Reverend Dr. Doug Poe of Wesley Theological Seminary and the Lewis Center for Leadership, and incoming Council of Bishops President Cynthia Fierro-Harvey. So we hope to see you there, and thank you once again for joining us and for the conversation. Blessings to all of you.
Thank
you, Shannon. Thank you, Bishop Carter.
Thank you. Thank you both.
Thank you.